Hey everybody. How are you doing? Hoping my mic and everything is all settled in. Let me know if not. But welcome to this week's Griscom stream, August 10th, 2021. In the middle of the fight, right? In the middle of the fight, we're going to be talking about climate change and the climate despair. Really. I'm sure people who are listening to this have seen the reports, or at least seen the headlines about them, and they're quite dire. But as we know, it's been dire for a while. I want to spend a little bit of time breaking down why it's important to take these warnings extremely seriously and to push back against the climate denialism of centrist liberals like Biden and certainly the far right, but to also make sure that we don't fall into a kind of doomer fetish. Right? It's a long fight. The clock is ticking, but we have to realize where our strengths are and what we can do instead of just falling into despair. Because I understand the moral and ethical and ecological reality that we face, but sometimes it's really, really important to make sure, obviously take care of yourself and recognize that it's all right to feel a bit overwhelmed, but not to fall into this place, because I think too often, especially people who follow and care about environmental politics, there can become a kind of doomerism that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and in its worst aspects turns into a kind of anti-human discourse. But if we're If people are here, let me just introduce the stream. I think we have some new folks listening. So these are sort of more weekly informal streams. So feel free to jump in the chat. We take super chat questions and just questions from the chat in general during these. I'd like to hear what y'all are thinking. So feel free to throw those in there. I usually go through a couple stories or points as we're going, but really I try to make these as interactive as possible. So it's good to see so many people showing up already. It's really great, and it's been so wonderful having all the support for the Project Left Reckoning. Also tomorrow at 7 Central, we'll have a main show with Matt Leck, as always, and we're going to be joined by Derek Davison and Daniel Bessner to be talking a little bit about Dan Crenshaw and his desire to continue American imperialist adventures in the Middle East. We're going to be talking about the kind of lost moment that American centrism is in when it comes to foreign policy, and also talking about their new show, which you should check out, called American Prestige. I've been a big fan of that for a while, but definitely looking forward to that. I hope people are all right wherever they are. I know our friends in the Pacific Northwest are really going through a pretty nasty heat wave, so definitely stay safe, keep your windows closed as much as possible, and try to make sure that you don't overheat. And yeah, well, let's see. Oh yeah, also before we get any further, I want to make sure people don't sleep on the bonus episode we did that came out a Sunday evening with Corey Pine, where Corey Pine sort of took us and Matt Leck to task for our kind of skepticism over UFOs. We also talked about J.D. Vance and why Peter Thiel is so interested in politics these days. It was a really, really fun conversation. It was great to hang out with Corey Pine again. So make sure that you check that out too. You can get access to that and all the bonus episodes on patreon.com/leftreckoning. Yeah, we already got some aliens in the chat too, so good to go. Well, let me start. Question mark. It says, how to avoid climate change is the same as what do we do about capitalism. The left of capital hasn't been clear on this either, which is their main role, I'm assuming you're saying. Yeah, I mean, this Biden stuff, I think it's so despicable, the way that he has been talking about climate change in the aftermath of this report, just given what we've seen under his tenure as president, and also when he was vice president under Obama. And maybe that's a good place to start. We have this really frightening report coming out, that is basically saying that the effects of climate change at this point are locked in. In the next few years, over 1 billion people will be suffering from extreme heat waves. Those will become a regular part of people's lives if they're not able to mitigate them. if they're not able to mitigate climate change at all, global warming at all, it will become an annual event for folks. It came out right before this big summit in Glasgow, where we're getting a lot of air from Biden and his team saying this is the moment we're going to sign another historic accord. But remember that the Paris Accord itself, Obama's crowning achievement, was nowhere near close to what is needed on a mass scale to really deal with the reality of climate change. And you get a lot of big talk from John Kerry and Joe Biden in a way, and maybe this is just a personal thing, but in a way that really infuriates me to see somebody like Biden going on about, I understand that climate change is real, we have to do something, when this guy's the goddamn president. And not only has he had a lack of action when it comes to reducing America's carbon footprint, he has approved more. He's set to approve more new drilling permits than George W. Bush, right? That's the legacy that we're already getting from Biden. And, all this kind of stuff is like, it's only been 6 months or whatever. He's been running to make sure, and he's been sprinting to increase the amount of oil contracts in the United States. It's one of those things that is truly, truly despicable. But he learned from the best. And, obviously Donald Trump was a disaster for the planet. But Obama was horrendous for the planet. And he doesn't get criticized enough for it because Obama understood that a lot of what people want, a lot of what people have been sort of primed to react to when it comes to climate change is not concrete action, but symbolic action. And here's Obama talking shortly after his presidency, during the height of Trumpian horrors, about what he finds his legacy to be.
I was extraordinarily proud of the Paris Accords because, look, I know, I know we're an oil country, and we need American energy, and by the way, American energy production. You wouldn't always know it, but it went up every year I was president. And that whole suddenly America's like the biggest oil producer and the biggest that was me, people. I just want you to so it's a little like sometimes you go to Wall Street and folks will be grumbling about anti-business. I said, have you checked where your stocks were when I came in office and where they are now? What are you talking? What are you complaining about? Just say thank you, please. Because I want to raise your taxes a couple percent.
Yeah, and it's been a really telling example of what the Obama administration truly was. To see what his post-presidency has been, and I want to point that out. One, because I think it's really critical that people remember the role of that party and specifically Obama in worsening the conditions. But two, showing how cheap a lot of the kind of public demands, how cheaply they can be met in the media and the general understanding in the population when it comes to climate change. And I don't think I'm not blaming the general population on this. I'm blaming the politicians on it. And I think that it's time that we really start reckoning with what our strategy needs to be. Because the fact is that there's, a lot of misinformation about climate change, but even beyond that, there's a lot of hopelessness, feelings of hopelessness and helplessness about it. And if we don't start to wrestle with ways to get out of this problem, then we're just screaming louder than other people, right? We're just sort of watching the devastation with a little bit more intensity than others. And if your politics are about more than just kind of like having the right moral stance, but also about helping as many people as possible, we need a very, very, very different strategy. It's amazing to see these oil companies, how well that they've been able to sort of promote lifestyle change politics instead of systemic politics. And it's obvious why they do it. It's because they know that any kind of serious wrestling with climate change is going to cut into their profits. And we'll get into how we have to deal with that in a second. But they know that. So they've been promoting this kind of idea that the way that we can deal with climate change is just sort of, one, through just like general awareness, right? And two, through personal changes to our consumption habits, right? And, absolutely, there's stuff that you can be doing, and I think it's great. I know a lot of people who are listening to this show, people including myself, they make certain decisions to say, okay, well, I'm not going to do this because I know that it has an outsized carbon footprint. I think that's great. I think we can all be more mindful. But that's been sold to us as a kind of fake solution because at the end of the day, while you might be living this wonderful green life yourself, right? These oil companies are ramping up drilling in the United States, right? Which is just, a lease on the end of the planet. And I think that we have to recognize that years and years of neoliberalism have sort of sold us this idea that personal decisions are what really matter at the end of the day when it comes to climate change. And that's not true at all, right? They've sold you this lie that we're facing climate change because all of these people out there, they're just, they don't think things through. They're only thinking of the short term, blah, blah, blah. And the group of people that truly drives climate change are the rich and the super wealthy. And not just because of their personal consumption habits. Matt Huber, and we'll get to some of his work a little bit later. We've interviewed him on the show. People should check out those interviews and also all the pieces that Matt has written. Matt Huber has a really great piece. I think it was published in Jacobin about 4 or 5 months ago, talking about this kind of fixation that some people on like the green left have with, pointing out, the kind of lifestyles of the rich and famous and how damaging they are for climate change. No doubt about it. Getting exotic ingredients shipped to your kitchen is a waste, right? And it's very harmful for the environment. Flying around all the time is wasteful and damaging to the environment. But the people who truly, truly drive climate change are the airline companies and the fossil fuel companies, et cetera, right? And it's always, even at that level, so even at the most gross excess, right, which is what billionaires do, which again should be made illegal. I don't have any qualms with punishing the rich, right? But even there, it still is sort of framed as a question of personal decision making instead of what it needs to be. I mean, at this point, it absolutely has to be thought of as systemic. It has to be thought of as like, okay, so who's making the plans for industry at the beginning of the year, right? Currently, the vast majority of that planning is done by private corporations. And what do private corporations do? They try to maximize their profits. Right now, there are trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars invested into fossil fuel production. Remember, investment means an expectation of future returns on your investment, right? That's capital power. That's the power that capital has. And they have no intention of slowing down production, right? As long as there's still money to be made in it, the expectation of money to be made in it, they're going to continue more exploratory activities to extract more fossil fuel from the earth and to burn that, right? And until we start to get serious about taking control of those aspects of the economy, we can do all of the personal moralizing that we want, but it will be ineffective, right? And the only forces that can address these issues right now are large-scale mass planning from the government and labor taking control of these systems. Let me see. And here's some good points on this. From the chat, I want to make sure I'm getting y'all in here too. There was somebody who was saying something about Spencer says, literally, you can barely see the giant Rocky Mountains. Climate despair is very relevant to me right now, and I'm sorry to all of our friends out west who have really been experiencing it, in an extremely dramatic way. But I think, here's Spencer too. Says, hey, Griscom, checking in from Utah. The air here has been filled with smoke from the west for about a week now. The sunlight is orange. AQI is practically the worst in the world. I mean, that kind of stuff is horrific, and I think that a lot of people, especially people who have been going through, I mean, the stuff that I've been seeing out west in Oregon and California and Utah, the photographs, I mean, they're very striking, and you can see how that might engage some folks, encourage some folks into action. One of the difficulties right now is that the avenues for folks feel very limited, and I think that we can't wait for these things to really affect people, in this kind of dramatic way to get the actions that we need. Like, for example, Trey Bar says, I went to a 2019 climate strike in Portland. The speakers on the main stage were mostly entrepreneurs hawking some new water bottle or other gadget that will somehow save the environment. Yeah, it's absolutely. I mean, that kind of stuff is necessary. And, people should check out the interview we did with Ryan Pollock last week, and which was about a kind of a green labor plan for Texas, but it's something that could be specific to any state or community. The idea is to start putting these things on paper and to start presenting these as a labor issue, because not only is that the only vehicle that we're going to have to be able to take over these industries, but two, a lot of the green industry is not very labor friendly right now. And the people smell the opportunity. They know that green branding is really popular. I mean, that's why Exxon and Chevron, these corporations that are actively destroying the planet, spend so much of their marketing budgets right now on this kind of greenwashing of their companies. The auto manufacturers as well are doing this with electric vehicles. Two. So let me look at some of I want to express some of these numbers, though, for why I'm saying that, while it's like, you experience something like this, and like, I understand, like, for example, Spencer is seeing all the stuff happening in his community that is, is very frightening and visceral and real. You can see the smoke, blocking out the sun. I can't imagine a more striking image for what the future, under climate change will look like. But you also have to remember that 57% of Americans still don't think that climate change will harm them. And I know those numbers are frustrating, right? But we have to start thinking of practical political solutions for it, right? For how we can get out of this problem. Because while more and more people recognize that climate change is a problem, it's still extremely abstract. And there's been a kind of environmental theory for a long time that, as people start to see big weather events happening around them, then maybe they'll recognize that the writing is on the wall, right? And there's a couple problems with that, but the first of all is that, if you wait for that moment, it's starting to get to the too late period. And that's essentially what this report is saying as well, right? It's like we've already gone to a point where this stuff is locked in. So now the question is, how do we get people to get mobilized enough to do something about it? And I think that we have to have a very broad-based political strategy to work at this. And this is a good tee-off. Josh says, is the 100 companies responsible for 71% of emissions idea misleading? Can it make energy and transport companies seem separate from the wider economy? This is an interesting point. I'm sure people have seen the statistic before. It's definitely one that's, it's really great. You can throw that in a Twitter thread easily. It's a slogan that sort of, I think, is good in the sense that it directs our energies and our frustrations toward those companies. But the kind of criticism you get from the more neoliberal side, right, the more Vox, Reed, and Levin side, is that, well, don't forget that all of these companies are producing plastics and fossil fuels for consumption by people in the regular economy. So to act like they're just, doing emissions for no reason and it's not being driven by consumption is wrong, right? And I've seen that talking point from centrists work on people, right? Because nobody wants to be made a fool of, right? And here's the here's the real structural point, and this is the kind of unlocking that you have to do to really start to think about these statistics in a political way, in a productive political way, is no doubt that these companies are not just, producing emission just for the hell of it. They're doing it because they are seeking profit, right? But the decision to do that is made by those companies. The decision to create environments for those companies to profit in that way is created by the government and the legal system. How do I mean? I live in Austin, Texas. That's a city that there's been a lot of people who are fighting to have a greener cityscape. There have been some improvements from when I was a kid when it comes to things like bike lanes and things like that. And there's also hope of building some form of public transportation, right? But right now we have a bus system that, can be very hit or miss for folks. And what that means is that people drive. And if you want to get groceries, you got to get in the car. That's really the only option you have, or maybe get a ride share, or try to ride your bicycle down a very, very busy street and risk getting into an accident, right? And I know there's a lot of people who are very passionate about fighting for the bike system here, so I'm not saying I'm saying continue that fight, but I'm making the structural point is like the reason that people drive their cars to do simple things like get groceries or go see friends or hang out is because we've built an infrastructure that encourages people to do that. The reason that if I want to go and visit my family in Louisiana, right, people typically drive or fly, is not just because, oh man, you're making these horrible personal decisions. It's because there is no significant or serious public rail that could get me to those destinations, right? So yes, those industries are producing for consumption, but that consumption is driven by one, public decisions, right? So lack of public transport, things, et cetera, and also the need of those corporations to profit. And those things are very, very much connected, right? I have maybe later, a bit from the one of the Exxon lobbyists sort of spilling the beans on all of their political strategies, right? And remember that the United States government and big corporations are in conversation with one another constantly, right? So the fact that we don't have that kind of infrastructure here is not just because, we've had misguided politicians. It's because they're taking marching orders from these corporations. The fact that Obama, and I know I have a chat here and I'll get to that in 1 second, but I want to make this point that the fact that Obama, think about the way that he frames what he's talking about when he's talking about oil and Wall Street profits in that clip we just played. He's framing that as having conversations, direct conversations with the leaders of industry and extremely wealthy folks. When the hell was the last time Barack Obama was like really having meaningful conversations with the general population or the working class? Doesn't happen. We don't have access to the presidency like these people do, right? And it's important to remember, like, that's how the state relates to capitalists. So, to answer that first question about the 100 companies being responsible for 71% of emissions, that is a good slogan. I think that adding the additional political education to it and saying, okay, well, why does this happen, is crucial. But also don't accept that BS kind of debunking that we've been getting from the Vox crowd, that whole group of people who always love the Matt Iglesias people, who like to sort of sit on the outside and criticize people trying to make sure that the planet doesn't literally burn, because they don't really have that much to stand on. Jerry Ty says, I live in Vancouver, Canada. While the city isn't covered in smoke, more than 1 billion sea creatures were cooked to death on our last heat wave. I'm sorry, it's that kind of stuff drives me nuts. And I know here in the Gulf of Mexico, we're seeing larger and larger dead zones too. It's scary stuff. Trepar says, it would take me almost 2 days to travel by train to my hometown. It's less than an hour flight or a 12-hour car ride. They all cost about the same for tickets and fuel, right? That's it. I mean, that's exactly what we mean when we're talking about these decisions are sort of made for you. And Jerry, thanks again. Says Ottawa is still talking about generating revenues from pipelines to combat climate change. It's like fighting climate change with more climate change. Yeah, it's ridiculous. And for people who might have just joined, we open up by playing Obama bragging about the fact that he increased oil production every year that he was president, and also noting that Biden is now set to approve more drilling permits in the United States than George W. Bush, right? So all of this crap about liberals believing in science, it's nonsensical. And until we start to build a kind of political consciousness on the left, and honestly, at this point, just in the general population, we're just going to get, which is essentially green marketing for politics. I think that there's something even more evil about the climate denial about Biden, somebody who tweeted out when this report came out that we have to act, than even some of these, pure right wingers, because at least with them, they're just straight up saying like, yeah, I don't think this is real, and oil makes good money, right? Biden's playing this double game where he's like trying to speak to all of us who are worried about the climate catastrophe, while enriching the people who are driving it. And well, let's look at some of these bigger points, because I think that, I think we all recognize the severity of the moment, but the name of this stream is, how to avoid climate, what did I call it? Avoiding climate despair. And I want to make sure that I stay true to that, because things are very, very bad. And I would never lie to folks. And I don't think it's helpful to lie to people. But we have to have a different strategy. And we have to have a very broad strategy. Because we do have the power to effectively choke off these systems. But we haven't realized it. Last week, I talked to Ryan Pollock. And I think that people should watch that interview. Ryan is a great labor organizer here in Texas who's been working very hard, along with other members of the IBEW and the AFL-CIO here, to start to put some meat on the bones of the concept that will be the only way out of this catastrophe. And that concept is just transition, which means that we need to ramp down our fossil fuel consumption in this country. There's no doubt about it. But we can't do it in a way that destroys the incomes of entire communities across the United States, and specifically across states like Texas, which produce the vast majority of not just things like extracting oil, but also just emissions in general, right? And we need to find a way to get people to come on our side of this. And the way that you are going to do that is not by moralizing. It's not going to get done by moralizing people. It's going to be showing them that a green future is not only a necessary imperative for our survival as a species, but it's actually something that is going to be positive for their life. Not just because they'll survive, but actually because it will mean more money in their pockets, a more secure future, the opportunity to be able to raise children, which is something that many, many working class people feel is out of their reach right now. And the only way that we're going to be able to do that is with a just transition, right? We live in a country where people are housing insecure, where people are food insecure. These are major issues that's a very, that's, a bread and butter issue that you could talk to people about. And two, the building sector is a huge part of fossil fuel emissions, right? Being able to retrofit already existing buildings and building new, beautiful, green public housing across this country, that is a solution to a problem that most people can understand. As I was saying earlier, 57% of Americans still don't think that climate change is going to affect them. And we can make the argument all we want that, oh, you're wrong, you're mistaken. But what people do recognize is that I can't buy a house. Or if I do have one, I recognize that people in my community are getting pushed out because people can't afford the taxes on their houses, right? There is a complete breakdown in the housing market in this country, right? More and more people are being pushed out of their homes, and more working people, especially in our generation, are feeling that they're just going to be perpetual renters, and then the rent is too damn high, right? People don't feel secure in their housing. That's a huge, the housing industry is a huge contributor to climate change. Selling people the idea that we're going to create affordable housing, public housing, and also a lot of different jobs and opportunities for people in those industries already. And also we're going to make it green is a critical selling point, right? Talking to people about higher wages than what they're getting right now is a great way to cut out and choke out wasteful parts of the American economy, right? Being able to start to talk to people about jobs and justice and housing and healthcare, right? While using our ability as a class and as a political movement to move more money into green industries and to green already existing industries, and also most importantly to decommission industries that are actively harming the planet. That's the way forward, and the only way you're going to get that done is with a just transition. And it's something that we've been missing for a long time, is that kind of connection with labor, right? Because as I stated earlier, the fact is that there are trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars in investment in extremely harmful industries in this country and across the globe. And they're just not going to give that up without a fight. So the only way that we could beat that is not to, let's get the CEO of Exxon to recognize, sir, you're ruining the planet. No, it's to force them to step down. It's to take over those industries, to nationalize them. And how do you do that? You leverage the aspirations and the dreams and the power of working class people in the United States, both in the workplace, right? To say, okay, well, we're not going to do this, this, and that. And then two, as a political movement that says we demand a just transition, we demand green jobs now, and we demand a complete reshuffling of the power dynamics in this country, in this economy. And I know it's big. I know it sounds big. But that's the only way forward. These things are very much tied together. And one note, too, before I get to some of this other stuff about neoliberalism and Matt Huber's piece I think people should be reading, is let's not also forget that when we're talking about concentration of power, we are talking about concentration of power in the global north. And that needs to be addressed. It's critical that that kind of power is challenged here. If you're an American, if you're a Canadian, if you're in the UK, that you are trying to find ways to break the power of these fossil fuel corporations, because those are the ones that are in that top 100 companies when it comes to emissions. There's just no doubt about it. And I don't think it's worthwhile to get into this kind of like moralizing about like, if you live in North America, and you're a worker, you're somehow like so tied to these people that you've now been morally stained. I mean, this kind of like Christian discourse of like sin and moral and soul and stuff like that, it really needs to be tamped down a lot on the left, because it creates these kind of absurd notions where people are unable to tell the difference between somebody in the C-suite of a fossil fuel corporation and the people whose labor is exploited to maintain those systems, right? Because the people who labor in those systems, those are the people who, if we build the political movements that are able to bring them in and convince them that we have something better on the other side, can actually break that power. Jeffrey says, just to my point about housing, I'm sorry, this is a tragedy, but it's phrased in a fun way. In Toronto, we have a great housing program of knocking down existing housing, replacing them with McMansions and selling those to foreign investors. Clearly the way forward. Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt about it. And that this is becoming a very global phenomenon, that housing has just become, and that's that's just a fundamental contradiction of capitalism, right? Where you take something's exchange value over their use value. What does that mean? What's the use value of a home? Well, to house people. What's the exchange value of the home? Well, it's what you're going to get on the market for it. And the exchange value has become completely divorced from the use value, in the sense that you just have these foreign corporations and companies like BlackRock just buying up homes just to hold as investment while you have people homeless. Again, these are the kind of things that I think most people recognize. I think more and more people are recognizing across the globe that housing is just something that is feeling more and more out of reach. These are opportunities for us to use. Let me get to this. I want to start actually with this Kate Aronoff piece because I think it highlights the kind of folly of waiting for Biden. Because if you're waiting for Biden, for action on this, it's much too late. Biden has been touting the infrastructure deal. $1 trillion. It should have been a hell of a lot more. In that deal, there are very worrying clauses articulating a plan for more privatization of our infrastructure, and that is just a surefire example of the lack of seriousness that this infrastructure deal has when it comes to addressing climate change. And as I was talking about earlier, climate change is driven by these kind of decisions to create car cities, and the fact that we don't have significant investment into these into alternatives is a joke. And the big thing that Biden has been fixating on, right, has been electric vehicles, right? Because it's a kind of easy solution, I think, for a lot of people to wrestle with. It's like, okay, well, if we aren't burning, gasoline in our cars, we'll be cutting our emissions. And don't get me wrong, electric vehicles can certainly be a part of the solution, but let's not kid ourselves about, this electricity production in the United States is still a pretty dirty industry. But even on that metric, let's even say we just are having green electricity across the country. Kate Aronoff, in her piece in the New Republic, sort of criticizing Joe Biden's infrastructure deal, I think really outlines it. And this is her point about, you know what, hold up one moment, because I have to add my microphone here, or you won't be able to hear me. Okay, I think this should work. Let me see. Decarbonization is fundamentally a planning problem. The United States, among other rich countries, has grown allergic to planning, at least in the areas that might help reduce emissions. Even in the places where it's most bullish, like electric vehicles, the best the administration can imagine is tweaks around the edges. American policymakers aren't even picking up the tools that have served us in the past. Decades of public policy have hollowed out the kinds of administrative expertise that carried out the New Deal and the war mobilization that followed it. Where federal agencies closely regulated the prices of key commodities, nationalized important factories, and created industries virtually whole cloth to feed the war effort. Just plowing money into existing programs, the only thing reconciliation can really do, won't make these programs more functional or empower their employees to think expansively about their role in solving the greatest challenge humanity has ever faced. Neither can it euthanize the fossil fuel industry. And if that isn't an indictment enough, because it is so amazing to realize that we're just unable as a society right now. If you want to talk about decline, it's that we're not able to address these issues. The funding for electronic vehicles, right, under Biden is nowhere near close enough to the kind of radical shift that would be needed to really implement them on a mass scale. What do I mean by that? And I don't have it up, but I'll read from the same piece. Again, the piece is named Playing Nice with the Fossil Fuel Industry is Climate Denial by Kate Aronoff. She also notes here that, that Biden's kind of electronic EV vehicle program that he's been pushing forward, and sort of touting as this is how he's addressing climate change. And we've seen, Joe Biden driving an electronic Jeep Wrangler and an F-150 on the White House lawn. Kate notes that the promise from the auto industry on electronic vehicles is even less than it was before Trump tore them up. And two, the funding for the goal is pretty meager. Electric vehicles and buses only get $7.5 billion each in the bipartisan infrastructure plan, to be parceled out over 10 years in the form of incentives rather than direct spending. There may be $20 billion more over a decade for EV rebates in the reconciliation package advanced on Monday, but not much else. The United States spends about $40 billion a year on pet food. And we're talking about $7.5 billion put out in incentives over a decade as the way that we're going to do something about climate change. Waiting for Biden-style incrementalism is climate denial. It's as simple as that. So we're not going. There is no one's going to come from up high to give it to us. The Biden administration has shown very, very clearly that they're willing to play ball with the wealthy and the established interests on this, all while selling themselves as green. But it's not coming from them. It's locked in. I wanted to note. I want to go here to this Matt Huber piece because it makes the point as well. That we have to change our discourse around this stuff if we want to do something about it. We can't do the kind of moralizing that has dominated so much of the green movement for way too long. Let me pull this up here for y'all. This is a beautiful piece by Matt Huber, who, again, if people aren't familiar, should definitely be reading all of his work. But let me pull this up for y'all. This is from a piece in Jackman put out a couple months ago called "Climate Doom Won't Save the Planet." And in this, he sort of breaks down previous strategies of how the environmental movement has dealt with the problem of climate change, and how to create mass movements that can do something about it. And the first strategy that Huber sort of lays out has been one of the most dominant ones, which is, basically a kind of moralizing and fixation on personal experience, right? Which again, that's the kind of thing that can motivate some of us. I get that, but it's just not going to be the path forward. Not only because there's so much misinformation and feelings of helplessness and hopelessness out there, but also because by the time we wait for everybody to be affected by climate change in a way that they see as being brought by climate change, it will be far too late. But this piece, he makes a point about a different solution. While more and more surely are experiencing climate disasters, for most working people, the primary obstacle to survival is the daily struggle to afford the basics of life, like food, electricity, rent, and healthcare. Capitalism is a daily disaster of lacking the most rudimentary needs for material security and human dignity. Education and experience-based theories of climate mobilization also hinge on rather negative visions of either dire climate futures or disastrous presents. A working-class strategy would mobilize climate action on a decidedly positive platform of improving most people's lives. And it is not as if these material needs are distractions from the climate crisis. Food, housing, energy, and transport are the key sectors we need to decarbonize. The problem is most climate policy technocrats tend to assume restructuring these sectors will increase or internalize cost through carbon taxes or fees. A working class strategy would do the opposite by guaranteeing access to decommodified goods. I think that really outlays the only path out of climate despair, because I understand that it can be very, very easy to fall into a feeling of helplessness and hopelessness. And in fact, that is the way that most Americans currently feel about it. 40% of Americans feel helpless to do anything about climate change, and 29% feel hopeless that climate change will be materially and functionally addressed. That comes into a greater kind of pessimism, I think, that exists in the working class regarding politics. Everybody has seen, after decades and decades of neoliberalism, that their lives get worse. Politics make their lives worse. And we have to do the radical thing here. We have to do the radical thing here and convince working class people that politics can change their lives for the better. Neoliberalism destroyed the public. And ironically, not ironically, very purposefully, it also destroyed our ability to function as a national government, to be able to provide services and bold plans that are necessary to address climate change. What Biden is doing right now is certainly a decision on his end, but it's also the result of structural changes in the way that the American government interacts with society. The fact that in this infrastructure deal, which again does very little to actually address climate change, there are already mechanisms within the infrastructure deal to privatize it, to privatize large aspects of it, to do sell-offs of public goods and assets, just shows how bankrupt the American neoliberal ruling class is. So how do we fight that? Well, we can't rely on them. We can't rely on these kind of solutions from technocrats and neoliberals like Biden. We have to start bringing the case to the people. Again, I really suggest people go back and watch our interview with Ryan from last week, because those are the kind of conversations that are needed to have and to happen, right? We need a just transition. We need a Green New Deal. We need a jobs program. We need housing guarantees, right? We need all of these things, and we can do that and we can sell it to people. The two big hurdles that we have are a political establishment that is going to fight tooth and nail to prevent that from happening, and a pessimism amongst the left and amongst the working class that something good is actually going to happen, right? We have to beat that negativity in our thinking, and the only way to do that is by having conversations with folks. The reason that I'm up and not devastated right now is because I see that despite the fact that things are so bad, people are mobilizing and they're organizing. Movements like the youth movements on climate through Sunrise Movement are great, but seeing union activity trying to address this problem across the country, but notably in the state of Texas, that is an encouraging thing. Because you know what? If you want to start greening the economy, you're going to need people to do it. And if you want people to do it, you're going to need labor, and you're going to need people with experience and know-how and understanding of these systems. And what we need to be doing is maybe spending a little bit less of our time worrying so much about what's going on, with people at the top of society, and start talking to people in our community, start talking to people that we can reach to organize to do something different. Because if you start to get working people in this country, if you get this idea into their head that not only can we do a lot to mitigate climate disaster, but we can do it in a way that makes your life better, it's going to be really hard for somebody like Joe Biden to stand in the way of that. It's going to be really hard for somebody like Josh Hawley to stand in the way of that. It's going to be really hard for Exxon to stand in the way of that. And that's the only way forward. And we're seeing a shift to a more labor-focused politics when it comes to climate change, and that is a good damn thing. Because we have the tools and the solutions and the ideas, but we need to build a different kind of politics that is bringing in more and more working class people, not just as voters, but also in strategic industries as well. We need to be putting up the ideas of nationalization of fossil fuel companies, not just as as a way to to end the climate devastation, but also as ways to redistribute wealth to working people. Because I'll tell you one thing people experienced here is when you saw over COVID-19 lack of profitability in oil. I think a lot of oil workers here in Texas saw, oh shit, the CEOs are going to get golden parachutes right? They're going to get out of this scot-free, and we're just going to be left with a worse quality of life. And I think that's something that we need to start doing the groundwork for, is understanding we need to get public control of our electric grid. We need to get public control of fossil fuel industries. And the only path to do that is to leverage the working class at large, but also strategically in those industries. William says, do neoliberals not care if their children starve? Look to New Mexico. I mean, neoliberals is a tough one, because I would say, do neoliberals, I think that, like, for people who are just everyday people who have that kind of worldview, I think that, they just have a kind of ideological barrier to being able to wrestle with, these problems. And if you're talking about neoliberals as like the ruling class, as in wealthy people, then we need to, they're not worried about it, because they know that there will be parts of the planet that they could be fine in. New Mexico is a great example of this. Massive internal migration of the wealthy and the upper class into areas that are going to be less affected by increases in temperatures than others, notably places that are a little higher up, right? You're seeing it, I mean, internally throughout the country. I'm sure people in the chat have plenty of, examples of places in their areas where rich people are already migrating into communities that are going to be less affected by climate change. I think that that's the bet that most of them have. I think that they don't think that there's anything that can be done about it that wouldn't negatively impact their ability to profit and exploit the vast majority of people. That's the big get of it. And the ones who are seriously worried about climate change is why they want to do this kind of tinkering, because I think a lot of them do realize the class politics of climate change politics, and that's why they've tried to neoliberalize it. That's why it has always been framed as a personal choice, right? Do you care about climate change, or do you not care about climate change? Instead of what it is, a class issue, an imperialism issue, right, and a colonial issue, right? Climate change, the only solutions that I've seen that aren't just absolute hellscapes are these kind of reshufflings. I do think, though, that there is a capitalist solution to climate change, and that is going to be making working people pay for it. Make working people pay for it in massive reductions in the quality of your life, massive reductions in your ability to provide for yourself, and massive reductions in human population, right? That's the capitalist future regarding climate change. A socialist future is very different and includes a mass redistribution of not just wealth, but power, and a reorganizing of the economy to be able to start to deal with these challenges. And lastly, and critically, planning. We're going to need to do planning to be able to get out of here. Well, I want to see if you'll have some stuff in the chat before we head out. We're going to be talking about foreign policy tomorrow. I'm sorry, it's not the most fun thing to talk about, but it is dire, and we have two real choices: is to just accept devastation and despair, or to embrace the radical potential that we have to remake the world and make it better. Leo Panich has a line somewhere, and I should find it so I can provide the citation later, but that no matter how dire the climate reporting gets, no matter how dire that situation gets, we can never, ever, one, allow ourselves to fall into despair, but also to lose the ability to plan our movements out, to have in the long-term horizon, right? We need to be thinking 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the line, always. Because if you start to lose that historical perspective, then you will lose your ability, one, to act because you just get overwhelmed, but two, to be able to build the movements that have the ability to restructure and redistribute power in the society, right? If you go into a political question, right, and say, what can I do this very, very second right now to be able to address climate change, you're going to be lost because it's an impossible question to answer. But if you start to say, okay, what can we do as a left in the next 5 years? Then it starts to become a little bit more manageable because you can say, okay, what we need to do is we need to start building community and building political movements that people recognize are not just class focused, but are class rooted. And also really center this idea that we're fighting not just against climate change, but we're fighting against a system that perpetuates climate change. And we can do it. I have to remind you again, the conversations that we're having right now, the abilities that we have right now to flex our power has grown immensely just in the past 5 years, right? And we can't just start to lay the seeds right now and then start to panic. We have to hold true, still be, critical of our movements and always changing and being dynamic, but recognize that we're doing nothing short of trying to change global systems that have been entrenched and in power for hundreds and hundreds of years. You can't just expect some big awakening to happen overnight, but you have to say and look around you and say, are we in a stronger position right now than we were 5 years ago? And the answer is unequivocally yes. Is there a lot more that we can be doing? Absolutely. Are there a lot of lessons that we still haven't really reckoned with? For sure. But we're seeing mobilization in the unions, we're seeing mobilization in the youth, and we're seeing mobilizations across this country in places where people thought that was never possible. And we can't just sit pretty on those achievements, but we have to recognize that, okay, there is polarization happening. People are starting to recognize and think of themselves as workers instead of just whatever kind of, random identity or personal identity, right? They're saying, I'm a working class person, right? These are positive developments. And what we need to do is to find those vehicles that can start to direct people who are having these realizations into political action. That's the immediate task. And you only can recognize that that's the immediate task if you're able to look towards the future. And I worry sometimes that the way that a lot of people rhetorically talk about climate change, it sort of forbids that kind of thinking, right? Because you have to say, this is an absolute emergency, right? And then it creates panic. We can't fall into despair. You'll never realize how close we are to victory until we're on the other side, and just and know that this is a fight that is going to take a lot from us. I hope I hope that was helpful. We got it. We have a pretty big fight ahead of us, but we have the tools and we have the mobilizations to do something different, and we can't ever forget that. And more importantly than anything, we can't fall into the trap of individualism. You have to think collectively about these issues, because when you start falling into the trap of individualism, neoliberalism wins. Right? Because neoliberalism destroyed the public. It destroyed our ability to imagine a different world. And it just sort of trapped us into, these kind of individual ideological prisons. All right, y'all. Tomorrow at 7:20, I'll be joined by Matt Leck, as always, along with our friends Daniel Bessner and Derek Davison. We're going to be talking about Biden's foreign policy, why centrist liberalism is sort of at an ideological crisis, even though it's very much in control of the foreign policy apparatus. And also talk about everyone's favorite one-eyed man, Dan Crenshaw, and his imperialist desires for adventure in Afghanistan. I'll see y'all there. Bye.